Just want to welcome those folks who've already signed in. We're going to wait just a minute or so so that all the various people who are coming along can log in. While we're waiting, I wanted to just go over a few little bits and pieces about dealing with this morning's event in Zoom. The chat is open for discussions between participants. This note is in the chat already. Please ensure you're selecting panelists and attendees in the to field when sending a message so that all other attendees can see what you are writing. We won't be answering questions in the chat, but we will answer questions during the Q&A that have been placed in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So remember, if you want to ask a question directly to a panelist, use the Q&A button, and we'll get to those once the program is over. You can ask questions during the presentations, but they'll be answered only afterwards in the Q&A session, so we get through the program and don't keep people here all day. And we really hope you enjoyed today's event. So we'll be going live here in another minute or so. Well, welcome everybody to our webinar this morning about EJN and publishing in the European Journal of Neuroscience and the mechanisms by which one might publish and review and so on. I'm John Foxe. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the European Journal of Neuroscience. I've been the Editor-in-Chief since about 2015. And I have to say, it's been really the honor of a career to serve as the Editor-in-Chief, as an Irish person originally, to lead this amazing journal has been just an incredible thrill. I'm delighted to be joined today by two of our four senior editors. So I and the four senior editors lead the journal's scientific enterprise. These four senior editors are Antoine Adamantidis. Antoine was actually supposed to be here today, but got called away to Paris at the last minute, so I'll be filling in for Antoine. Vidita Vaidya, who is based in Mumbai. Paola Bovolenta, who is here today as well, who's based in Spain. And Yoland Smith, who is a Quebecer, but is at Emory University down in Atlanta, Georgia. And you'll meet those folks later today. And one of the things I'd say here is that between myself and the four senior editors, we cover a broad spectrum of the neurosciences, really from molecules to mind, from cell and molecular work through circuit work, animal work, human work, all the way to systems and computational work. I'm not going to feature all of our section editors, but we're currently supported by 35 section editors who handle the review process for us. You're going to learn a lot about that, representing 27 countries and 24 nationalities. So we're really an international crew. These are just a few that I put up just to feature Chandan and Tara there, Martin and YS. And our section editors are spread, as you can see here, across the globe. At EJN, we have a very simple philosophy. It is scientific publishing by scientists for scientists. Papers sent to EJN are handled by your peers, not by professional editors or people who've left the field, but by your fellow scientists. EJN is the official journal of the Federation of European Neuroscience Society, so it's a society-owned journal. We publish papers on a broad range of topics to advance understanding of the nervous system in both health and disease, thereby improving the diagnosis and treatment of neurological neuropsychiatric disorders. If you are interested in submitting to EJN, EJN has no submission fees or page charges, and manuscripts are available online within 2 to 3 days of acceptance, and final issues are published every 2 weeks. FENS and SFN members have free access to EJN, and many of the countries you're joining us from have transitional deals with our publishing house, Wiley, so that you can publish freely, open access freely. And there's our website if you want to check us out. Just to emphasize how global we are, over the past 36 months, the top submitting countries are listed there in the right, and you can see where many papers come from. There are obviously many other countries where we get papers from, but that gives you just a sense of it. And in 2020, EJN received over 1,100 submissions, and we're well on schedule to receive in excess of that again in 2021. So quite a lot of papers, a lot of submitters from all over the globe. We're extremely proud of our 32-year history of outstanding publications and contributions to the field. And here is actually our very first cover from January 1989, held by the great Ray Guillory, who passed away just a couple of years ago, but was the first editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Neuroscience. And I think I speak for all the senior editors that we're very proud to be part of a tradition started by Ray and the folks back in the 1980s. You'll be in good company if you publish in EJN. We've had 19 EJN papers that have been authored by Nobel Prize winners, but you don't have to win a Nobel Prize to publish with us. It's fine if you do. We'll be happy about it. It would be even better if you publish one of your papers that ultimately ends up winning you the Nobel Prize. But that's not what science is about. Science is about doing good, solid work, and we're interested in your good, solid scientific work here at EJN. As well as our regular issues, which is our bread and butter business, standard papers that are sent to us unsolicited from across the spectrum of neurosciences. Each year we publish a series of special issues, about half a dozen of those in a given year. We had a really superb issue on addiction last year, or the year before, the basal ganglia. And this was a really lovely special issue, for example, celebrating the life and work of Tom Isaacs, who was a great a stalwart in the domain of Parkinson's disease, who passed away in 2017. And you can check out the website to see upcoming and open calls for special issues. They might very well be in your field or in your domain of neuroscience. This is where you would have been, I would be handing over to Antoine, but as I say, Antoine was called away at the last minute, so I'm going to bumble my way through the first part of this, but I think I might know a little bit about handling of manuscripts that are submitted to EJN. So let me go ahead with that. And just a shout out to Paul Bovolenta at Oxford University, who's a former editor-in-chief alongside me at EJN, and who really helped prepare a lot of these materials originally. So I mentioned this already. EJN, our editorial board is an international editorial board, and there are 4 layers, if you like, of editors. There's the senior editorial board, myself and the 4 senior editors I've already introduced you to. Then our section editors across a bunch of domains. I know this is way too small to see, but I already introduced you to a few. We have a registered reports editors group, and then we have a cadre of reviewing editors. These are highly expert people across broad domain of areas around the globe, who really help us with expert reviews of papers. These people are amazing reviewers of scientific papers. And of course, we solicit reviews from people who are not part of the reviewing editorial board. So what happens, right? So you're about to publish your paper. You've put years of work, sweat, tears, unsociable hours into producing this beautiful paper. You submit on a Friday night. And by Wednesday, you've been clicking the button, what's going on, what's going on, what's going on? I haven't heard anything. So what are we doing with your paper? Well, this looks a little complicated, but let me walk you through the process. So the first thing to say is at EJN, our basic average turnaround to first decision would be, for a paper that actually goes into review, would be in the region of about 37 days. That's the average. Sometimes it's as short as 3 weeks, and sometimes it goes a little bit longer, as a paper might be difficult to review or find reviewers for. So now you've submitted your paper. Well, the first thing that happens is it goes to our editorial office for quality control. And I'll come to that momentarily, what that means. But what we first do is we check through the paper to make sure all the appropriate bits and pieces are in there, such as, an ethics statement and so on. But once it clears quality control, and that's usually 24 to 36 hours later, then it will arrive with either myself or one of the senior editors. And so obviously we have five of us, and what we do is we divvy out the papers according to our areas of expertise to be handled by one of the senior editorial staff, at which point the senior editor or myself will look at the paper in detail and decide whether the paper merits going into review. And I have to tell you that about a third of the papers that come to our desk, they'll receive a review from us, but they will not be sent further into the process. And again, I'll come to reasons why that's the case, and later Yoland will explain why that's the case. The vast majority of papers that are rejected without review are done so because they're not really neuroscience, or there's something fundamentally wrong with the way the papers are organized or written. We at EJN do not reject papers because of novelty. If the paper is reporting good, solid science, we will consider, we're a society journal, and that's our philosophy, is that we serve the members of our society and the members of the neuroscience community. That process might take 2 or 3 days. The typical range is 1 to 5 days, at which point we would assign the paper to an appropriate section editor. You'll remember there are 35 of those, 32 section editors and 3 registered report editors, who would have, again, the domain expertise to handle your paper. And then that section editor would engage reviewers. The section editor does have the option to kick back to us and say, this paper doesn't merit further review, and to provide a short review for us, at which point it would go back out in this way. So there's some reject without review here at the section editorial level. But at this point, the section editor reaches out for expert reviewers that he or she knows will be able to handle your paper appropriately. And at that point, your paper is sent out to reviewers. The process then takes typically between 14 to 28 days. A couple of weeks will be on the inside, because we give 2 weeks to reviewers to review your paper. And of course, it sometimes takes a little bit of time to engage those reviewers. And as reviewers want to do, they'll often let it go a few days, and sometimes a little bit longer. But at that point, the reviewers would submit their scores, comments, and recommendations to the section editor. And this is where a decision first gets made. And those decisions are straightforward, right? Accept as submitted. That would be extraordinarily rare, I have to say. I've seen that maybe 2 or 3 times in a decade. All papers need revisions, almost certainly. Best case scenario for an author, of course, would be minor revision without re-review. It's just, there's some bits and pieces you need to fix up, and we'll just make a decision at the editorial level when the paper comes back. More likely scenario, maybe there's a major revision where you really need to clean up some stuff and do some additional work, and we'll be sending it back to the reviewers. And then we get into rejections. Rejections because of insufficient information, rejections because the work is scientifically unsound, rejection because the work is not appropriate for the journal, although this would be very unlikely to have occurred here. It would be more likely up here with the senior editors. Oops, sorry. And then another category is a reject with invitation to resubmit. And again, I'm not going to unpack that in any detail right now, but because that will come later in the presentation. Once the section editor has the reviewer's comments and recommendations, the section editor now prepares a summary of those reviews and his or her own thoughts about the paper and the quality of the paper, and submits that summary along with this with a recommendation to the senior editors, at which point the senior editors and the editor-in-chief would make the decision to reject it or not, or to accept it or not. And at this point in the process, after reviews, about 28% of the originally submitted papers will end up being rejected or rejected with referral to a different Wiley journal, whereas 35% of the original papers will be accepted. So there'll either be a revise and re-review or revise with editorial review, and then that will almost certainly lead ultimately to an acceptance. So that's really the flow of the process, and you can see the general number of days that are involved. So again, quality control at the editorial office, 1 to 2 days. A determination of whether the work is suitable for the journal and has general scientific quality at the senior editors, 1 to 5 days. Reviewer selection invitations 3 to 15, and you can read the rest of it for yourself. Evaluation recommendation 1 to 2 days. So typical range in the 21 to 60 days. Obviously, it gets a little frustrating when you're 2 months out, but sometimes the process, in order to do it right and to get good, solid, sound reviews and fair, thorough reviews to you, it can take us that long. We aim to be shorter, but that's the reality of it out there. Sorry. What is quality control? Quality control is checking for completeness and formatting of the manuscript, the quality of the figures for the reviewers. Can we actually interpret your figures? Are they big enough? Are the fonts legible? Can you see the data? Ethical issues. Do you have the appropriate institutional clearance? Have you checked with your IACUC about your animal work? Do you have full approval of all your co-authors? This is a big one. Papers often get bounced back because we have email addresses that are bouncing. So when you're filling out those forms, and sometimes it's a little bit painful when you're submitting the paper, make sure you actually have your co-authors' emails, because obviously we have to ensure that the co-authors are willing to be authors on the paper. And so the number of times where papers end up spending a few days in purgatory because the email addresses are not correct is actually more than you'd imagine. Is there availability of non-published materials for critical review? Textual similarities, frankly, plagiarism. We run a quality control check using software to make sure that there's not a surfeit of textual similarities, information that's been taken from other places. And the other one that is a hiccup often is the quality of the English writing. We don't expect Joycean prose. We don't expect that you could publish it as a fiction or anything like that. We don't expect that. We want you to be able to tell your story, but we must be able to actually interpret the English. And sometimes the quality of the English is not where it needs to be to even be able to really divine what's been done in the work, and that would be a problem. So here are the basic editorial decisions. We often distinguish among the following 5 possibilities. The manuscript does not fit with the aims of the journal and is scientifically so poor it is unlikely to be, it is very likely to be rejected after review, and that would be an editorial rejection, or what we know as a desk rejection. The manuscript is suited for publication, can proceed to production, again, acceptance. The manuscript requires revisions in the text or data analysis, that's a revision. This is an important one. The manuscript is scientifically sound, but additional experiment or analyses are necessary to strengthen the conclusions to really get you over the finish line. And that would be in the sort of zone of a major revision or a rejection resubmission. And then the last one is the manuscript is unsuitable for publication and/or the revisions required would be too extensive. And then we would issue a rejection. I'm going to hand the reins over to my great friend and colleague and one of our longtime superb section editors, Guillaume Rousselet, who's at the University of Glasgow. Guillaume, take it away, please. Guillaume, you're muted. Sorry.
Yes, that will work better. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Guillaume Rousselet. I'm section editor at EJN. And today in this section, I'm going to tell you about some of the things that John has started to talk about related to the presentation of results and statistical analysis. So I'm just going to go through a few common mistakes we see quite often. There's much more to cover. The slides are going to be available at the end of the webinar, so you don't need to write down anything. Here I'm pointing out some resources I think are really important, that they flag a lot of common mistakes and how to do a better job at presenting and analyzing data. A very good starting point to know the standards we expect in the journal are would be in this editorial I wrote a few years ago with John Foxe and Paola, where we set out some of the policies of the journal. And an important policy is that we strongly discourage the use of bar graphs. Here's an example here where we have the same data shown in many different ways, and there's pros and cons for using these different formats. But clearly one we don't want to see in a journal are bar graphs because they hide a lot of useful information. And quite often as editor, I I send back papers asking the authors to redo their figures, because there's no point of sending a paper like that to reviewers, because they won't have enough information to assess the data. I think a default, at least for relatively small sample sizes, is to use a scatter plot, maybe in conjunction with a box plot, but so that individual data points can be seen. But that's not the end of the story. So if you want to see a more detailed example, you can read our editorial, for instance, where we show an example here where you have 2 independent groups and each tested in 2 dependent conditions. A good way to represent such data is to show the pairwise differences. The distribution of differences gives you a good indication of the effect sizes, the spread across participants, for instance. But that's not sufficient, because when you have paired measurements, you need to understand how they link to each other to assess things like flow and ceiling effects. So for instance, you can link the observations that way, or you could plot one condition as a function of another. So essentially, in EJN, you don't have page limits for the result section, so we would expect a lot of detailed graphical representation so we can go through a very fruitful review process. Other things we want to see clear justification of methods. So quite often, the method section is all about the experimental design and so on, but there's not much about statistical tests. So we'd like to see in the method section justification for the models that are used. For instance, you do a t-test on means. Why is that? Why is that a good model to use? We like to have a clear justification for the sample size, and preferably supported by a power analysis. And there's plenty of tools available to do that for all sorts of models. And we'd like to see a clear justification for the alpha label. Typically, 0.05 is used out of tradition. There's no rationale for using that value, but it needs to be justified. You also need to take into account that p-values near 0.05 are actually associated with weak evidence against the nuke. So it really is not a good default threshold. Things we often see that highlight a lot of issues and understanding about statistics is we often see things like a test of normality assumptions, where someone would check that using, let's say, a Shapiro-Wilcox test and report a p-value for that. The problem when you do that is that you end up using the p-value to accept the null, so you're committing a statistical fallacy. And those tests have issues with statistical power. So quite often, if you have a low sample size, the test is going to fail to reject, so you'll assume you have normality, but another distribution could explain the data equally well. And more importantly, most of the time we know the answer, because most things we measure in neuroscience, it doesn't matter of the field, are not normally distributed. They're bounded and skewed, and we already know the population is not normally distributed, so other models should be used instead. So what should you use? Well, there's plenty of alternative robust statistical analysis on the market that don't make standard assumptions about normality. You can also investigate the residuals of your models using plenty of free tools. And you can go a step further and use model comparison, predictive modeling, and so on to really check the quality of your models. Then if you move to the result sections, where I see most of the time big issues is in the language that is used to describe the results. And here I point to 3 very important references and resources that can provide example on how to describe frequentist results, including correct descriptions of p-values and confidence intervals. But let's jump into an example. Let's say you have results where you have 2 groups, A and B, and you have the mean for each group, and then you have a difference of -4 and a confidence interval and a p-value. How are you going to describe the results? Well, some people would say, well, it's not significant, but it really is confusing. What does it mean? Does it mean it's not significant clinically? It's not an important result? Or sometimes I often see things described as, there's no difference between the group, there's no effect. That is clearly incorrect. There is an effect. It's -4. Question is it an important effect? Can you put it in context? And some statisticians, like Frank Harrell, would say, the brutal truth is that, well, if you just focus on the p-value and you say, well, it's not significant, you haven't learned much, but there's much more to the data to that. So you would say, the money was spent. And I see that quite often, and it's a bit of a joke here, but if you're tempted to say something like it's approaching significance, p-value near 0.06, when you also have to apply the rule the other way. You should say, well, it's approaching non-significance when it's near 0.04. So this is just to say that we need to use better language to describe the results and make use of what we have. So here you could say, well, related to the p-value, Assuming our model, the probability is 0.4 that another study will deal a test statistics for comparing two means that is more impressive than what we observed in our study if A and B had exactly the same true mean. You might think, well, that's really a mouthful, but that is a correct description of what the p-value means. And related to the confidence interval, you could say something like, given our model, mean difference is highly compatible with our data, range from -13 to 5. But then you could go a bit further. You could illustrate the results in detail. You could try to put the values in context. Tell your reader, is -4 a big difference? What does it mean concretely? And obviously, if you do a t-test on means and you seem to find a weak effect, well, that's not the end of the story because the populations could differ in other ways. And if you have an effect, p inferior to 0.05, you're very happy, you think you've got something, well, you might say it's significant, but what does it mean again? Does it have a practical significance? Or you might say that there is an effect we prove, we demonstrated, that doesn't follow from the p-value directly. You need much more evidence than that. The healthy attitude would be to say, well, there's a problem in my model, because most models used in neuroscience are, could be better, or they're just plain wrong. So you want to think, use the p-value as a warning signal to check your model that there might be something else going on in your data. And then if we move on to the discussion, quite often we have sort of binary discussions where the results are really dichotomized. So for instance, you may have one study that find a particular effect, and that's a confidence interval here, which is declared significant. And then another study is presented as disagreeing with the previous study, even though the effect is the same, but now the confidence interval is wider and it's declared as non-significant. So that's the problem when results are just described in terms of the p-value instead of looking at the actual values and providing more context. So in a nutshell, statistical significance is neither necessary nor sufficient for determining the scientific or practical significance of a set of observations. And that's a quote from this really important paper here. I strongly encourage you also to read that paper on abandoning statistical significance, which is not about getting rid of p-values, which is to say, well, p-values should be treated as continuous values, and it's just one piece of the puzzle. There's much more in your data than the p-value. It's not an end point. And finally, I'm going to end with a plea. Please share your data and your code. It is really important. During the reviewing process, it will help settle a lot of discussions. When your stuff is all available, we can tell reviewers, knock yourself out. If you want to do another fancy analysis, you can have a go yourself. It will increase the impact and trustworthiness of your research. And to put it frankly, the best person to analyze your data is really not likely to be you. So if you share your data and your code, someone will pick it up and do something great with it, if you're lucky, and we all learn from the process. All right, so that's it for me. And our next speaker is going to be Paola Bovolenta, and she's going to tell you how to prepare a useful review report. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. And hope you can see my screen now. So welcome to everybody. I'm Paola Bovolenta, and since a year or so, I joined the European Journal of Neuroscience as a senior editor, although I served as a reviewer editor for a number of years before. As John said, EJN is a journal for scientists, from scientists, so you might be sometimes dealing with EJN with the hat of an author, but sometimes you might deal with EJN with the hat of a reviewer. And what we would like to give some hint on how to prepare a useful review report. And I'm not talking about useful because I don't think we need to classify them good or bad, but just useful reports. And why a review should be useful? Well, they should be useful for the authors in first place, because they need to provide constructive input for improving in the cases needed. There are papers that might not need it, and you should say so, to improve the study somehow. It should be useful for the editors, all type of editors, because they need to provide an argument for support of the final decision, acceptance, rejection, whatever. They need to be useful also for the reviewer, because reviewing is spending time, and it might give you some new ideas, new information that you didn't have before. So as a reviewer, please look at reviewing processes as a learning process. And also that now that the large majority of reviewing process is public and you can read it, it might be also useful for the readers, because it can give some reason to read a particular manuscript. And also it's nice to see the reviewing process, how it gets across. So basically, for all of this reason, reviewing a manuscript is a responsibility, and one should do it the best possible. So this implies that you shouldn't accept an invitation to review if you have a conflict of interest, if your expertise is not very, it is very far from that of the manuscript. Sometimes it's nice to have the view of somebody that is not particularly closer, but if you really have no cues, better not to review. Also, maybe you shouldn't review if you have no reasonable time, no time to do it in a reasonable time frame. Remember that the author can be you, and you are eager to know an answer soon. So also do not review if you believe that you cannot provide an accurate assessment of the paper for any other reason that are not those above. Now, what instead a review should do when you accept, what should you do? You should use your scientific experience and expertise to really assess the quality of the paper, assess the hypothesis, what is the question behind the paper, check for the scientific, the design of the study, how the results are described, and whether the data support the interpretation and the conclusion that the authors make of their study. You should provide comments for all the above, that you should try to identify error, omission, and any particular ethical issue that will be discussed afterwards. And you should provide a narrative that support your recommendation for the editor. And also, it's very important that you should be prepared to revise to review a revised version of the manuscript. Is unfair to the author, asking for changes and that not checking for them. We should ask to somebody else, and that is highly unfair. So what should the editor and the reviewer looking for? First question is really the article or the topic within the scope of the journal? Is it neuroscience? This is something that really should be looked after by the editors. However, sometimes, I mean, even the reviewers can catch something that the editor hasn't and pointed out. And then one should really look for the quality and the rigor of science that is contained in the manuscript. And there are a number of questions that you really should look at. And I listed all in here. I probably don't need to read all of them, but the important is is the paper addressing a relevant scientific question? Are the results novel or confirmatory? EJN does not look for novelty, but looks for well done and well performed paper, even if they confirm previous result. This is important, but you should state whether this is the case, if it's one case or the other. Is the work too preliminary? Are the conclusions justified? Are the figures well presented? Is the literature well cited? Guillaume, you just heard very much about statistical analysis, so I'm not going to talk about that. And then you should look what are the areas that should be improved, and also for ethics that will be dealt afterwards. So how to structure a very useful review? Maybe the first paragraph should address a brief summary, the main goal of the study, what are the experimental design that has been used, the finding, summarize the finding. A second paragraph could, for example, include the overall appreciation that you have of the studies, whether there are advances in the field, confirmatory, and all of this. The third paragraph might have general, constructive, and always polite criticism, and then a list of major specific point or minor issue. Major specific point should address points that really you think will help to improve the message and the content of the study. Don't ask for additional experimental approach just to back up what is already there. Just ask for what will be really essential for improving the studies. Minor points will be to improve accuracy, typos, or this kind of issues. Of course, reviewing a review or an opinion article requires a different frame of mind, and one should ask different questions there. For example, is the review comprehensive? Does it synthesize the concept? There is a fair treatment of the literature. There are relevant conclusions in the review. The figure well illustrate and summarize the finding. There is a complete comprehensive list of references. And also it should include open question in the field where the field should go. So one should frame a review of in this way. Having said all of that, it clears that these two are example of useless review. Just saying that the paper is bad will just be deceiving for the author. I'm sure that most authors will be really happy to receive the last sentence. This paper is excellent and should be published, but this doesn't really help the editor. Why is excellent and why should be published is missing. So this is all, and I'll leave to Yoland Smith to talk about ethical consideration in scientific publishing. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. So let me just share my screen here. Here we go. Okay, so everybody should be just see my slide now, but that's my last slide. So let's bring back to the beginning here. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are, you know, the word to watch that. So as Paola mentioned, so I'm going to conclude really the presentation by talking about ethical consideration in scientific publishing, and which apply obviously to EJN, but apply to a lot of most of the peer-reviewed journal, which is clearly very important. And we pay as editors and really at all levels, we pay very close attention to that. So I'll highlight a few of those here in this presentation. So I'm going to talk specifically about 4 aspects of it. So talk about conflicts of interest, and Paola alluded a little bit to that. I go a little bit more detailed about this. And also one thing which is very important in ethical issues is how you describe and what is done in regard to the use of animals in your projects, in your papers, and also the use of human subjects. So that's something which is very important that you pay very close attention to it, and provide all the necessary information. And obviously that your study followed the guidelines which are acceptable, you know, for the use of animals or humans in research. And then we conclude by talking also about a very important point that John mentioned about plagiarism, which is something that we need to look at very carefully. So conflicts of interest, you know, it's a different level. It's essentially something that the authors, the reviewers, and us, the editors, must pay attention to and must be very honest about it. Okay. So first of all, I think the important is that as either an author's, a reviewer, or an editor's, you must declare if you have a conflict of interest. I mean, we cannot know all of this, but this is your responsibility to declare it. So if you're asked to review a papers, and you know that you have a conflict of interest, whether or not it's a positive that you are a friend of that person or somehow, and you know them too well, you have published with them before, or a negative one that you somehow, you know that your review is going to be biased because of different reason for that paper. So you should declare it and not review the paper. That's something really, really important. So as I mentioned here, you should not really obviously suggest, you know, as reviewers, friends or colleagues that are too close to you. So that's not the kind of person that you want to review the paper. And also on the reviewer side, then that's why you must decline to review if you feel that you're not going to be able to do that properly, or if you have very close relationship, you know, with the authors of the papers. And us on the editors, what we will do obviously is we'll pay attention to that and invite definitely reviewers which are outside of the author's institution, and we'll try to make sure that the authors that are the reviewers that are invited have not had any relationship, at least obviously based on publication with the authors of the paper. So what about the animal work? And that's something which is variable, unfortunately, and many papers have to go back to the authors about that to get more detail. So any type of animal work that you do, so it's very important that you state in the method section the species that has been used, the number of animals, which is something that we don't see a lot sometimes. You have no clue how many animals have been used. The age of the animal is important. The sex, really, there is definitely sex differences in many biological function that is important to know whether or not you use male or female, and if there were differences, pay attention to that, and where these animals are coming from. Okay, and this is important that the species of the species that you use at least is mentioned, if it's not in the title for various reasons, but you can at least, it need to be mentioned at least in the abstract. You know, you should not be looking for these pieces only when you get to the method section. I mean, we need to know that really ahead of time. Another aspect which is very important is the aspect of how pain and discomfort were taken care of in your procedures. So the anesthesia must be described, the dosage of anesthetic, the type of anesthetic, and also the analgesic that we use. You know, if there is any procedures done on animal, you must describe how you control the pain in these animals really post-operatively. What kind of veterinarian care this animal received, you know, during their period of recovery. So that's absolutely critical, and the papers will not go through if they don't have this information. You must mention the name of the animal use and care committee that reviewed your protocol, and that must be in line with the European Council of the European Parliament and the Council of Guidelines led by the NIH in the US. So there are many of those across the world, and usually they kind of converge under some common ground. But this is important that whatever guideline you're using are in line with those two here. The bottom line, I think the best way to make sure that you are, sorry about that, to make sure that you are in line with this is to follow these. You can go and look at that here. This is the ARRIVE guideline, the Animal Research Reporting for In Vivo Experiment. This is what is that the EJN is following when you look at this, and this is what you need to pay attention to. And if you look at that carefully, you will find how much detail you need to provide about your design of experiments and definitely the care of animals. And work that is not, you know, does not conform to that is not going to be accepted. It's going to go back to the authors for more information. And if you cannot provide that, and if we know that this has not been done according to this, the work is going to be rejected. And the same thing is true for the human subjects. So you must provide detail about the number of individuals you've been using, the demographics, the age, the gender, the race. If you're using, obviously, people with disease, you must provide a lot of information about the disorder, the drug, the treatment that they are taking. So all of that is absolutely very, very important. And you must add, you know, a statement again that your protocol essentially is following known ethical protocol, and it has been accepted, and it followed the standard, the recognized standard for human research, but in the Declaration of Helsinki. And you have here, you know, where to find that. And I'm sure that everybody who does human research, this is what you have to go by, you know, for any publication. You state again the internal review board that review your protocol, and you must also obtain informed consent from all participants to include their personal information, images, and so on, which goes really in line with the International Committee on Medical Journal Editors. This is what really Wiley is following for that. And the same thing here. So if that, you know, is not, if you cannot follow this and go by that, you know, the papers are not going to be published in EJN. The last part about the ethical issues is plagiarism, which is a very important aspect, and sometimes can be a little bit, there is some gray zone about plagiarism, what really is plagiarism and what we consider plagiarism as editors. For instance, here are some examples that I'm sure we all go through and we wonder at some point about when we write papers. Is it plagiarism if I copy parts of my own paper into another paper? Like, for instance, if I copy parts of my own method section. Is it plagiarism even if I use, you know, a copy paste a paragraph there? It's my own method section, so am I plagiarism myself, in fact? Or if I reuse a figure from my own published work in, for example, a book chapter review. So is that correct to do that? Or if I publish, if you are a PhD student who is finishing up their thesis, and then you obviously put all your data in your thesis and then in the form of papers, and then you publish that into a peer-reviewed journal. So is that okay to do that? Is that a double publishing of the work? So this is all kind of issue that we wonder about. So I will try to get over some of those and give you some advice about that, how to deal with that. So clearly what is really aspect, which is very important, which is unacceptable about plagiarism is when you taking the work of others and you try to put that in as your own work, okay? So that is frank plagiarism. This is absolutely unacceptable. And you may not get caught if you do it, if you're lucky, but if you get caught, the consequences can be pretty serious. Okay, so this is something really important. So most of the cases usually that we see is this kind of inadvertent plagiarism, right? Or infringement of copyright. So this is something that may happen, which can be quite common. So the one way to avoid that, if you're not sure, is just to make sure that you cite wherever you took your information. If you're copying, pasting something from even your own document, cite the paper where that is coming from. So this way you are really, we acknowledge, okay, this is where you took it. Then the editors can decide, okay, so you must rewrite this, it's too much, but at least you have been honest and you have told us, where the material comes from. And the same thing is true for the permission to use previous, images and so on. There are copyrights. These images really belong to the publisher. You must ask for copyright and just go over and make sure that you have all this paperwork done really properly to avoid any problem about copyright issues. As John mentioned at the beginning, so this is something every paper is going to be looked at for the text, and textual type of similarities with what is already published in the literature. It will be cross-checked for that. And if you have indeed, copy-paste material from other papers, whether or not this is yours or previous papers, it will come out. So it's not going to be really, you're not going to be, if you take it with a paragraph in the discussion of someone else and put that in your own discussion, we will find it. And that is something, then it's not going to escape this. So that's something important to really to keep in mind. And this is obviously very important because we don't want to publish, data from that has been copied from others. So here are some level of plagiarism that we deal with following this type of metrics. So first of all, the level 1, which is relatively like the method section, which is often the case. Okay, see you find in this that there is some some plagiarism if you want, but this is really what is showing up is paragraph in the method section that's coming from your own paper in the past. Okay, so that's something which is quite common. So one thing to do there really, whether or not ideally you can rewrite slightly your method, but at some point there is only one way to describe some techniques, it's okay, but just cite again where you took it, originally. So that will help as well. So you say, as described in previous studies, and then you cite your paper. That will help kind of making sure that there's no confusion. So if you start copying sentences, from the introduction or discussion from your own work, again, that might be okay if it's not too many and not too much. Again, good best way is to cite, where if you want to use that, cite where you put it. On the other hand, I think it should not be too many, because then you start wondering about, the aspect of originality of this particular paper versus what you have already published. Okay, so you should not find really big paragraph of that, put from one paper to the other. Then it's the last 3 levels are more important, and this is where you start copying sentences or data from the introductory discussions from others into your papers. That is not right, okay, and that is going to generate some scrutiny about the papers, and you will be told about that, and you will be asked to, if it's not too much, if it's really, you will be asked to rewrite it, but that's something which is important. So the bottom line is that do not do that. Do not copy paste stuff from others into your manuscript. That's the way to avoid that. So here the results, if you have the same, you find out that essentially one figure or the results are exactly the same as what you have already published. You may have a reason to do that for some, but that's important, because then it definitely generates a lot of concerns about why are you republishing the same data? So you cannot do that. Obviously, it's not really, it's double publishing, and also the originality. What is new about this data if they have already been published? So this is something you cannot do, even if these are your own data, of course, and that will probably generate a reject if this is an important component of the paper. And finally, the most really important aspect is when you have really results taken from other studies into your paper. That is, there's no question to describe that. This is frank plagiarism, and this is going, the paper is going to be rejected, and also the journal is going to inform the host institution about that. So this is something which is ethically irresponsible, and that, you know, is something that we need to go at the institution level about this. Thus, to conclude that essentially for ethical issue about publishing is to adhere to the scientific method that you're using, be open and honest about yourself, about your data, cite the sources appropriately, and get permission to reuse published material. And also try, if you do that, you know, you try to avoid making the editors and the reviewers, you know, suspicious about your work. And I will then transfer back to John, and we'll be able to answer questions you may have submitted for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yoland, Guillaume, Paola, for that. I see some questions coming in. One from Donya. Your surname is truncated here, Avaspour maybe. And Donya is from Iran and asking, can I actually publish my article for free because I am from Iran and the cost is too high for me? And I think that's true not just in Iran, but many places. There are journals where the cost to publish is quite high. The cost to publish in EJN is $0, $0 shekel, €0, 0 rubles, everything. It's zero. We are a society-owned journal. Now let me make a distinction here. What happens is you can publish a paper for absolutely free with us in what we would call like the traditional publication mode, and then access to the paper is for a private person would be paywalled, but obviously institutions and library subscriptions. So that is the most common way for people to publish papers with us. There is one circumstance under which a fee would be charged to publish with us, and that is if one wanted to purchase the option for an open access paper. That in some parts of the world, and I believe this is also still true in Iran, if you wanted to have an open access paper with EJN, you'd probably have to pay the APC, the publishing charge. But you don't have to choose that. There's no requirement at all. You can publish with the traditional model. And what I would say is to many of the people who are on the call, who are from some of the European countries, certainly from the UK, from Ireland, from Norway, Finland, many other countries, Germany, there are transitional deals in place with the journal publisher and the countries, those countries, where authors can publish even open access completely free. So that's quite a substantial number of people who may be dialed in here as well. So that's the answer to that one. Thank you, Donya, for that question. Are there other questions? Yoland, how does EJN deal with manipulations in figures? Are figures checked as for plagiarism in text?
Yeah. Good. That's a very good one. I think that I did not mention here, but that essentially the same thing applies, right, as what we talked about. But here, I think someone is talking about, you know, fabrication, essentially that you are manipulating your figures to make it says something different than what the data really are. And that is clearly, it's not necessarily plagiarism, but that's a breach of ethics, right? You're falsifying your result by doing that. If we find some of this, and if either the reviewers, and that has happened, unfortunately, it does happen. And if you find that, so there is a process in place. First of all, clearly, we will give a chance to it will be mentioned, it will be raised, it will be looked at, you know, by the editors, and will be discussed in great detail to see what the problem is. And if we agree that there is really a problem there, we will go back to the authors to let them know about that it has been found, that we noticed this, and we want them to give them a chance to explain what has been done, you know, and try to get back to us about that, and then we'll review this. If the authors either do not reply to that or submit a reply which is not acceptable, that do not really address the point, then this issue we will go to the institution. This will be reported. It's a bit like the frank plagiarism. I mean, this isn't, because fabrication of data, falsifying data is definitely really bad. And you don't want science to be, you don't want whoever did that to be, you know, publishing papers. So this will go to the institution level, and then there will be some consequences.
I also just add to that, Yoland, that it's not impossible that something like that could slip by us, because people have gotten quite clever about that, and it does happen. We have certainly seen it at EJN. We've seen manipulated figures, and we've caught them, and we've had our reviewers tend to be pretty eagle-eyed. They're very expert, and they smell a rat when they see it. If something like that sneaks by, I really would just say to anybody these days, there are so much software being developed out there to check post-publication for those kinds of manipulations in figures, and that information is being called out on PubPeer, and that it's a hiding to nothing. It's a dead end. It's a cul-de-sac. Don't do it. You will eventually be caught for it, and you'll be forced to retract the paper. And not just that, but you may end up being, certainly, for example, in the US, being caught for something like that would be grounds for being recused from applying for NIH funds for a substantial amount of time, if not forever. So that sort of thing has really dire consequences. Not worth it. There's no shortcuts in our game. It's hard work all the way. A question from, and apologies for my pronunciations, from Teo Yao. For Guillaume, a question about data distribution. Is there a universal way to test the data belong to which distribution, i.e. given one data set, is there a method to determine this data set belong to which distribution, normal, Poisson, etc.?
Hi, Tao. So I'll make it short. The answer is no. That'd be great. But we know for a lot of types of data, the types of distributions that do a good job at describing them. So for instance, you know, if you do spike counting, it follows a Poisson distribution. If you look at person correct data, beta binomial does a good job. For reaction time data, to give you an illustration, for instance, you know, they're typically bounded and skewed distributions, and there's quite a large family of distributions that would do a good job. So you could fit an X-Gaussian distribution or a shifted log normal, and they would do an equally good job at describing the data. So the question then is interpretation. You know, so some models have parameters that are easier to interpret, and it might be more of a tradition of looking at them. So it goes beyond just pure statistics, and there are in the cognitive literature, for instance, there are models that are a bit more closer to the mechanisms that people think are at play. So no, there's no one size fits all. And the same for statistical tests. There's no way to say, well, that's my data, what test should I apply? They're all models, so they're all wrong. But some are more informative than others.
Awesome. Another question actually from Teo. If I want to use a figure from my own previous paper, which is an open access paper, should I get permission from the press or the journal? So I can answer that one, Teo. When you publish open access, it depends on the licensing, but for the vast majority of open access papers, the copyright belongs to you. So you can reuse the figure at will. The copyright does not belong to the publisher. That's one of the reasons for publishing under the open access license. I forget the precise name for it. But what you will definitely want to do is, if you're reusing the figure, you must attribute, you must tell the next journal and the next journal editor where the figure came from. It should be referred to, for example, in the legend of that figure. If you're, let's say you're reproducing it precisely, in the legend of the figure, it should say, you know, reproduced from, and give the citation, so that it's clear that this is not, you're not pretending it's a unique figure. A question, maybe this one's for you, Guillaume. Is there an expert team in place to check if the appropriate statistical analysis was applied in the submitted work? Not many times reviewers comment on this, and as an inappropriate method used to analyze may skew the findings.
Yeah, so we don't have a dedicated team, and it depends on people's expertise. So typically, when I get papers, because I like stats, I actually look at that more carefully, but quite often It'll go beyond my expertise, and then I'll try to find reviewers which I know will be able to help me make a good decision. And quite often I might get reviewers who are not directly in the field, but they cover the methods very well. So there we're looking at a conjunction of reviewers, someone who might know the research topic and someone who might know the methods aspect a bit more, and who can combine the two expertise to get a better review. But it is really tricky because if you look at statistics, there's so many ways you could analyze the same data set that even if you had a big team of statisticians, they would not cover everything. So we're looking for something that makes sense, sound advice, and that's why we need also those detailed, nice graphical representation, because that's one way we can check. We can do simple sanity check to see that the procedures make sense, that you don't get nonsense at the end, whatever the outcome of your analysis is. So it is not a simple process, really.
Agree, and I would just add that when a paper ultimately ends up on my desk, both on the intake side and on the decision side, we're doing some basic checking of standard things like, do the degrees of freedom make sense? Are the statistics reported in the proper way? We for example really ask people to report precise p-values rather than inequalities, so that we can do a real quick test to see, does this p-value actually come out of these number of subjects and this kind of a model, for example. Great, so thank you for that one, Abhijit. That's very helpful question. And I think here, let me see, Dr. Varsha Singh. Hi, thank you for the session, very helpful. I'm working on a neuropsych manuscript that involves neurological population epilepsy. Is there a predetermined proportion that EJN looks for in terms of publishing manuscripts in different subsections, especially in cognitive behavioral neuroscience? So Varsha, I'm not sure I entirely understand your question, but we very much welcome papers in neurological disease, psychiatric disease, and we have a section of the journal that's called Clinical and Translational Neuroscience, specifically for those kinds of studies. And I think, again, going back to the talks, the obvious thing is that it can't be observational work. It needs to be properly powered work. And I think one of the things that we would look for at EJN is not just sort of reporting differences between groups, but some hypothesis-driven work that goes to mechanism, goes to the neurobiology, neuropathological mechanism, so that it's a neuroscience paper as opposed to just, Parkinson's disease patients are worse at this than neurotypical controls or so on. So it needs to have some mechanistic depth to it. It needs to have a real neuroscience thesis. I hope that answers that question. Paola, a question for you. Sorry, I have a question regarding reviews. As a senior editor, how do you come up with a final decision when reviewers disagree about the status of a manuscript? Great question there.
Well, that is, there are different ways in which you can deal with this. If the reviewer are very, very different, you might be able to ask for a third opinion and consult an additional reviewer. However, the EJN structure is such a way that you have a section editor who is rather close to the topic. So in this case, the section editor usually look in depth to the manuscript and sort of give their own opinion, so that this balance out the opinion, and therefore you can count with different views. And usually when you consult more than one people, then the discrepancy sort of mellowed down. As a senior editor, also in this case, I try to look in depth to the manuscript to have an opinion on myself, and try to be the more considerate and the more fair for the outcome of the paper.
Excellent, thank you, Paola. It's a great question here, and we often get asked this, and I think we find it very pleasing when people ask about becoming editors. And there's a really nice question from Diana Navarrete in Mexico, and saying that she's interested in the process of editing a science paper. What are the qualifications necessary to be an editor in a journal? So Diana, I would say, and I don't know what stage of your career you're in, but one of the ways, so for example, to be an editor at EJN, it's a long road, and that is because we have only very experienced scientists. Our scientists are people who have, if you like, proven palmares, proven themselves as scientists over many years, are well known in the field, so that folks sending papers to us trust that their paper is being handled by a real expert, somebody who really knows what they're doing. And the way that one ends up, I suppose, as if you think about, for example, becoming a reviewing editor, so the first tier of the editorial board of EJN or any journal like ours in the society-owned journals, is to become a reviewer yourself and to provide very high quality reviews, to take Paola's wonderful presentation on board and produce good reviews and make yourself known to an editor. And in fact, I would say, if you have an area of expertise and you wanted to review for EJN, reach out to the section editor or the senior editor that works in your area and say, hey, you know what, I'm sending you my CV, I'd like to review for the journal, and we'll give you a test run. And one way in which folks then can say, if you take on some reviews in a year and you produce good quality reviews and we can rely on you, then that's how over time we say, on our editorial board meeting, we say, hey, did you know Diana Navarrette's been providing these incredible reviews for her? Maybe we should invite her on our reviewing editor board. And then you spend some time as a review editor, and bit by bit, again, you work your way up the system. That's the primary route to becoming an editor. I started out doing a lot of reviews. I actually really liked reviewing papers. I used to be good at it. I'm not so sure anymore. But I reviewed a lot of papers for former section editors at EJN, and that's exactly how I worked my way ultimately to become the editor-in-chief. It's really terrific for a young scientist reviewing other people's papers. You can think of it as a bit of a burden, but it's not that, because of course what it is it's how you hone your own skills. It's really, it's a fantastic way to become a much better scientist yourself. And of course what it does is it puts you in the front lines of science. You're getting the very latest information, the last thing that was done by a given group. So you're really getting that cutting edge stuff 2 years maybe before it would ultimately, or a year before it would ultimately appear in print. So that's one way. Now there is another way that youngsters can become editors, and there are people who will go through their PhD, perhaps through a postdoc, and then go to some of the more professional journals where they're young postdoc level people who are professional editors for some of the more commercial outfits. And so that's another model. It's not one I'm particularly personally fond of. I believe that one of the great strengths of a society journal like EJN is the fact that your papers are coming to people who really know what it is they're doing. So I hope that answers that question, Diana. Yoland, I have a question here coming in from Louise. For in vitro electrophysiology slice studies, do I need to report the total number of animals used, or is the total number of recorded cells sufficient?
That's a very good question, and that's one that I personally, I'm not a slice electrophysiologist myself, but I know the field quite well, and it's very variable, and I'm always puzzled a little bit about the way that people will present this data. The slice physiology, I would tell you that commonly what you see is that people indeed will not necessarily report, the total number of animals that they use for these studies. In the whole numbers that they do a slice every morning, they sacrifice an animal for that. They're not going to report that, which is incorrect. I think the total number should be reported. But what is most important here in this type of work, and then it comes down to maybe to the statistical approach of maybe in the art of Guillaume there, is that sometimes people do not report how many animals were used to generate the number of cells that the data come from. And that is very problematic, okay? Because every data in those papers are built on all the graph, whatever data they have, is built on the number of observation, number of cells that has been recorded. Okay, it can be an N of 12 or 15 or 20, but these are 20 cells. So these 20 cells may come from 2 animals, or they may come from 20 animals, from 20 slides. So you don't know. Some people will report that properly, and they will give you the number of slides, that means number of animals that they have collected data from, with the number of cells per animal. And this is what should be reported, that it is the minimum to be reported. But just reporting the number of cells without providing any idea about as to how many animals were used to generate this data is a problem. And that we try to flag that and request, the people at least to provide information about how many animals were used to generate this number of data. So that's something really important to pay attention to in this kind of work. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So we are over time. I think what we'll do is we'll do one more question. But before we do that, we just want to remind folks, please, that we will send a feedback survey by email, and we'd be really, really grateful if you would take just a few minutes, a couple of minutes to fill that out. We'd like to make these sessions as informative as possible, and we want to learn from you about what we can do better. Guillaume, one last one. Do you recommend to use statistical power analysis programs such as GPower to determine the sample size for an experiment?
But that could be a good start. Personally, I think everyone, if you want to do a good job of analyzing your data, you should really start learning a programming language like R or Python that has all the latest developments. Nowadays, most statisticians, if they come up with new methods, they'll be implemented in R and they'll be available there for free. So it's really good skills to pick up. The problem with packages like GPower, they're very limited in the types of models that are available, and they may have, quite often their power analysis make assumptions. So for instance, you do a t-test, power analysis with a t-test, it makes the assumption that you're dealing with a particular type of distribution. Maybe you're dealing with another type of distribution, and then you're stuck. Whereas there's plenty of packages in R where you'll have much more freedom and they can handle dramatically more ambitious types of models. So my advice, learn some R. It will open a lot of doors. And if you're a student, and you're not sure you want to go in research, if you learn enough R, you'll get a job in data science, and it's in high demand everywhere in the industry. So just go for it. It will open your mind and open doors. I guarantee that. Don't rely on black boxes. Excellent advice from Guillaume. And I would just add to Guillaume's answer there that we very strongly encourage registered reports, the registration of studies in advance of actually collecting the data. It's a fantastic way, and maybe we'll come back and talk about this another time. It's a fantastic way to set your study up, to make sure your design is good and solid, to generate appropriate power analyses for the work that you're going to do, and to have real experts in the field look at your experiments before you start them and say, hey, you might want to think about this control condition. Hey, your model is not the appropriate model. And that way you don't spend the next 8, 10 months, 2 years of your life doing an experiment that's doomed to fail. The registered report means that by definition, no matter what the results are, as long as you did what it is you said you would do, your paper will be published in the journal that accepts your stage 1 registered report. And we stand over that promise at EJN. We love to see registered reports coming in. It's a lot more work for us, but it's so much better for the scientific process. And that's a key thing. So I appreciate that there are other questions out there, but we've really kept a lot of folks a lot longer than we intended. We appreciate you. We're delighted you were here with us. I want to thank the panelists, thank the folks at FENS for setting this up for us. We're your EJN editors. We're here to help you publish your best work and to publish the best paper you possibly can. Let us help you. Reach out to us, submit your papers to us, and have a great weekend.